Welcome to this edition of Real World White Collar Law, where we talk about issues affecting businesses and the impact that white collar law can have on companies. I'm Declan Leonard. I'm the managing partner here at Berenzweig Leonard.
And together with Declan, I'm David Deitch. I'm special counsel here at Berenzweig Leonard, and I'm the lead of the firm's white collar defense and corporate compliance practice.
And David, it looks like you finally cleaned up your office today. It's looking very, very spiffy.
Everyone's seeing me in my natural habitat.
Yeah, they wouldn't let me in. They wouldn't do any production in my office. It's quite the disaster. Hey, but anyways, we've got a great topic here today. Only two business lawyers could be talking 2 days before Christmas about PPP, loan eligibility and forgiveness. What a topic, David. Why are we talking about this 2 days before Christmas?
Well, PPP is a huge issue for lots of businesses all around the country and here in Northern Virginia and in the whole DMV area, because a lot of firms took PPP loans when they were made available and when they were promised that they might get forgiveness for those loans. And now we're starting to get into the process where businesses are applying for that forgiveness, and the SBA is asking for a lot of information.
So we're going to be talking today about that SBA additional information request. It's a form 3509 form. Before we do that, though, let's just give a little bit of a catch up to the audience here. Where things stand, there was the I guess we're calling it the second stimulus that was passed. It's now waiting for the president's signature. He sort of the tweeter in chief sort of put things a little bit in upheaval last night by saying he wants a higher payment going out to Americans from $600 to $2,000. So we may have to stay tuned for our podcast on that particular thing because it's not finalized yet. Is that right?
That's right, and I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more on this podcast, on our Real World Employment Law podcast, all about PPP and how it affects businesses.
Yeah, and one thing to note, though, in that new stimulus, just to pass along, and I think this will ultimately make it into whatever is signed into law, is the deductibility of payroll expenses. There was a big issue, and it's caused a lot of uncertainty for companies as they do tax planning, year-end tax planning, of whether or not the money they spend on payroll expenses, which is a big tax deduction for companies. Up until this point, the IRS had taken the position that it was not deductible as an expense, and therefore it was leaving companies with an anticipated higher tax bill this particular year. As a result of the recent compromise that's made it through Congress, awaiting the president's signature, it looks like those payroll expenses are going to end up being deductible. So that's a huge sigh of relief for companies as they do their year-end tax planning. But let's jump into this form that the SBA has recently sent out. I think it's going to loan recipients of $2 million or more. So it's definitely on the higher side, but there were a lot of them that received that amount.
That's right. And, the SBA has created what it calls a safe harbor for any loans under $2 million, that it's going to assume that the certification of necessity that businesses gave who received loans smaller than $2 million was truthful, and they're not going to look into that carefully. But for all of those businesses that took larger loans, and like you said, there's a lot of those businesses, they've put out this Form 3509 and a whole series of frequently asked questions explaining what kind of information they want and why they want it. Go ahead, Declan.
Yeah, I guess what I was going to say is, we worked with our clients back in the day, back in the initial throes of PPP when they were actually getting the loans. Now we're at the tail end on the forgiveness side, and that's where this is arising. But back then they had to do a certification. It was a forward-looking certification back at the beginning of the pandemic, essentially, is the first few months of it. And it basically was a good faith certification. And the phraseology was that economic uncertainty made a PPP loan necessary to support a business's ongoing operations, and that was kind of it was a fairly simple a measurement for companies to be looking at as they were deciding whether or not to take PPP loans. Has that changed now as a result of this Form 3509 coming out of the SBA?
I would say yes and no, or probably more accurately, no and yes. It has not changed in that the SBA still says that it's going to judge the truthfulness of the good faith certification of necessity based on the circumstances the borrower was in at the time when the borrower made the certification. And that has not changed. But what's causing people concern is that the SBA in this Form 3509 is asking for a lot of information that goes far beyond what was in the borrower's mind at that time. And borrowers are reasonably concerned that the SBA is going to look at a business that was successful, maybe even successful because it got a PPP loan, and say that it didn't really need the loan in the first place, even if it seemed at the time that it did need the loan. And that's the big concern.
So a lot of these categories were not things that a company had to certify about at the time that they took a PPP loan. Let's go through some of those additional areas that the Form 3509 is now touching on. And again, this is for borrowers of $2 million or more. So if you're under $2 million, at least at this juncture, you're not required to fill this form out. But let's touch on a couple of the different areas that they're asking about.
Well, for example, they're asking you to compare your revenue and profits during like periods, both before and after the loan. Trying, I guess, to look at whether you've benefited too much from the loan. I'm not sure why. I'm struggling to explain why they want this information, because the fact that a business was successful should not indicate that they didn't need the loan. It just indicates that the loan was successful in doing exactly what it was designed to do.
Yeah, this one, and this is pretty much right out of the gate on the form. It basically says, hey, tell us what your gross revenue was in 2019 for the second quarter, and then tell us what your gross revenue was for 2020 in the second quarter being, the period when most people were applying for, getting, and using their PPP loans for the qualifying expenses. And this one, has caused some confusion for companies because obviously you're basically just filling in a number. And if that number in 2020 is higher than that number in 2019, you kind of look at it and you say, oh my gosh, from an optics standpoint, should we be concerned?
Yeah, there's definitely a kind of a mix of things going on here, Declan, for businesses, because on the one hand, if a business maintained its success at a level that it had before it took a PPP loan, that can hardly be seen as something wrong. That's exactly what the PPP loans were supposed to allow them to do. Yeah. But if the business was doing something different, if it was doing something out of the ordinary, that's going to raise eyebrows. It's going to raise some suspicions, perhaps. But more important, it's going to create really a PR problem. If you have businesses, to move on to some of the other information on the form, for example, they're asking about repayment of debt and they're asking about distributions to owners. If those were in the normal course, the same kinds of activities that the business undertook before it took the PPP loan, I would think that that's fine. But if they were doing something extraordinary during 2020 in terms of sending things out to owners or repaying debt, that could potentially at least look bad, even if it doesn't really indicate anything that was amiss at the time that they took the loan.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what companies need to do is they need to obviously work with their advisors, whether it's accountant, legal, work with their advisors the same way they worked on the front end for certification issues. We worked with a lot of our clients. We did corporate resolutions or other writings that basically documented why they fell within the certification in a good faith basis for a PPP loan. So for instance, that first question that we talked about, comparing revenue from 2019 to 2020, one interesting thing is it does not tell you which way to look at revenue, whether it's cash basis or accrual basis. And so if you look at things from an accrual basis, companies may have had in the second quarter of 2020, they may have actually had really good, let's just say, billings. They send out their invoices. The problem that I saw back then is companies were slow to pay their invoices all around in various industries. And so if you do it from a cash basis, that means you had less cash coming in the door in Q2. So I've told companies, you need to look at this from what were you worried about back then? Were you worried about companies that were slow paying your invoices? Because that's really cash in the door as opposed to accrual is really the only way you can pay your bills.
Yeah, and obviously the one thing they have to make sure is that they're comparing apples and apples and oranges and oranges.
Yes.
The good news here, of course, is the real good news, I think, is that the downside, at least if you take the SBA at face value, is not so bad. What the SBA has said is that it's going to look at these loans over $2 million. And if it determines that a certification of necessity was not, in fact, in good faith, it'll notify the borrower and that the borrower has to repay the loan, that the borrower is not going to get forgiveness. And more importantly, that if the borrower actually repays the loan, the SBA is not going to pursue the borrower in some way in administrative proceedings or through a referral. And they don't say a referral to what, but generally speaking, that's talking about referrals to law enforcement.
That's right. And there were so many businesses that received these PPP loans that I really just don't think that I don't think the purpose of the form is to create a gotcha scenario. It's interesting. The form does have, fill in the blank data. So we talked about, the revenue numbers, but it also has the ability, it also provides the ability for companies who are filling out the form seeking loan forgiveness. It has the ability to provide narratives, like written in narratives. And what I have encouraged companies, clients to do is to look at your original corporate resolution when you certified in the first place, or whatever other writing, however other you documented that process, and to go back and to use that to guide you as you fill in the narrative for some of those things. So, for instance, on the issue of revenue, you may have had questions back then. Let the SBA know what was kind of going on in your mindset. Just don't leave those narratives blank to the extent you think that they could give a more full picture.
It cannot be, Declan, that the government, the SBA, intends to punish businesses for surviving the pandemic. And that's really the backdrop of all of this. So if as you're saying, if a business can explain to the SBA that it had a particular set of concerns and show how those concerns were actually addressed by their PPP loan, and allowed them not to interrupt the business or to cause the business to suffer losses, I can't see how that's a problem. But it's certainly something that people want to be very careful about.
Yeah, guess what? A thriving business in 2020 means it's going to continue to employ people in 2021, 2022. I've always said the point of the PPP loan was not to get people through an 8-week or a 24-week period, because otherwise that would have been just a waste of money. That would have been throwing away money, because the whole purpose was more of a long-term view of making sure that these businesses not only survived, but thrived.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so many businesses have failed during the pandemic that, we want to keep the businesses that have survived and keep them afloat and keep them moving forward.
That's right. So bottom line, companies out there, no need to panic. Be smart on how you fill this out. Work with your advisors, and again, go through the process of loan forgiveness. And I think it'll work as originally intended. David, great conversation today on an important topic. Happy holidays to everybody out there, and thank you for joining us.